All right, we are going live. All right. So I'm not sure if on that link, if it lets us just start it up or how that works. It is broadcasting a black screen. I don't know why it's not. There we go. So I have it on. I mean, I posted it onto Twitter, the link on Twitter and on Facebook, but I don't have the ability to broadcast to those as well. I think in the future I'd be able to do the Facebook one as well. Uh-oh, it looks like it's dropping off. I am going to. There we go. I think we're back. All right, it's showing black on the YouTube live. I'm not entirely sure why here, but there we go. And then would you mind typing something onto that live chat? No, the one that is on my Twitter actually should be the right one. I mean, I can pull it up for you if you need, but yeah, that worked. So I can see it. We were talking live about the book club, All Quiet on the Western Front. Can you tell if there's any sound coming over to that YouTube channel? Oh no. Yeah, I mean, I can hear that, but then I can't hear your audio, so it's like we're back to square one again. Um, Let me try some different stuff here. Okay, Lyle, I can hear. Can you hear me? I have such a weird delay on this that it's nearly impossible for me to figure out what's going on.
Okay, I've got sound from you, Vance. Okay, I've got sound from you, Vance.
All right, we are.
Okay, I've got sound from you, Vance.
All right, we are.
Okay, I've got sound from you, Vance. Okay, I've got sound from you, Vance. I've got YouTube sound on a loop, but I don't have the Google connection. I've got YouTube sound on a loop, but I don't have the Google connection. I've got YouTube sound on a loop, but I don't have the Google connection. I've got YouTube sound on a loop, but I don't have the Google connection. YouTube sound on a loop, but I don't have the Google connection. I'm muting my YouTube now, and I'll let you troubleshoot on your end.
All right. So, is there any chance you can hear me now, Lyle? If that doesn't work, I don't know what will. Okay, is that working at all? That is not working. Oh, you guys can hear me? I can hear Lyle. I don't know if you can hear me, but I can hear Lyle, so we can just move forward that way. Great. So, let's get started. Lyle, can you hear me? Because I can hear you. This is a disaster. I never imagined this would be what would happen. So I think that the best thing to do is for me just to talk for a little while. I will trust that you guys can hear me and that it's not too painful. But there's no reason you can't just keep talking. I think the place that I was going to start with was the book Expectations. Oh, you guys can hear me? I can hear Lyle. I don't know if you can hear me, but I can hear Lyle, so we can just move forward that way. Great. So, let's get started. Lyle, can you hear me? Because I can hear you.
I've got you, Vance. Yeah, I've got you loud and clear.
I never imagined this would be what happened. So I think that the best thing to do. All right, I'm not. I have no idea how to handle this. So I know that Lyle and I put a ton of work into trying to figure this out. I thought we had it all figured out, but we don't. There's a huge delay, so talking through as I'm waiting to hear myself isn't going to work. So I think what I'm going to do is go through on the live chat and go forward. So Christopher Houseworth asked the question: how did everyone do the book, audio or old-fashioned book? And Hannah Neuenschwander said she read the book. M Rings 7830 did the audio, and Brian Scott said he actually read the book, kept a highlighter handy. I would have struggled to have done this book as an audiobook. The challenge for me. So Christopher Houseworth asked the question: how did everyone do the book, audio or old-fashioned book? And Neuenschwander said she read the book. M Rings 7830 did the audio, And Brian Scott said he actually read the book, kept a highlighter handy. I actually, I would have struggled to have done this book as an audiobook. The challenge for me. So anyway, the thing that I was saying, I'm just going to keep plowing forward. And if I see people chatting or telling me, if you type and say I should do something differently, just let me know. I'm having trouble getting Lyle back on the call. This is like a terrible hall of mirrors. So Christopher Elsworth asked the question, how did everyone do the book, audio or old-fashioned? All right. Have you read the book? Adam Ray? All right, so I'm just going to keep going. I think you guys can hear me. I'm not entirely sure, but my everything says that it's possible. You may not be able to see me right now, but we can do it without. So I don't know what you guys were expecting, but I'm a little bit embarrassed because when it came out, when I was thinking about this book, I actually didn't know what the Western Front was. I knew that it was World War I, and I had a concept that there was trench warfare, but it wasn't until I read the book that I sat down and started saying, like, what's this really all about? And this was a great education for me. Guys, if you can hear me, I am really sorry about this. So I'm just gonna keep going. I keep getting phone calls. Lyle, I bumped you off. I'm hearing all this echo. So I'm just gonna keep going, and we'll see how we're doing. So one of the biggest problems is that I can't tell. Vance, if you plugged in some headphones, we could avoid a super delayed feedback loop. It's not a feedback loop on my part. There's no sound going on in this background. And when Lyle and I were doing it, there was like a weird hall of mirrors going on. So I'm just going to keep going. It sounds clear now. I know you guys are about a 15 or 20 second delay behind me. So from here on out, I'm just going to keep going forward with the conversation and hope that you guys can type in what you were thinking. Was anybody else surprised by the fact that this was not that it was a World War I novel, but what the Western Front was and who was in the battle and how that was all working? Because for me, I just didn't know, and it kind of shows the severe lacking of my education about World War I and the things that led up to it. I've always known the things that happened around it. I knew, the kind of Franz Ferdinand being killed and how that prompted the war, but I didn't really understand how it went forward and how that impacted things. This is so incredibly silly that this is not working. So one of the questions that I asked is, what did it feel like to be on the side of the Germans, right? As an American, it's an unusual feeling. And how that impacted things. This is so incredibly silly that this is not working. So one of the questions that I asked is, what did it feel like to be on the side of the Germans, right? As an American, it's an unusual feeling. I love the Hardcore History podcast.
And how that impacted things.
So when I was thinking of the trench warfare, and I know that there was a movie that just came out, and it's a single shot where they follow behind the guys, or at least it's presented as though it's a single shot where they go through those trenches. But I actually went and looked up some of the maps of how those trenches worked, and seeing an aerial view where they've shown how far apart these people were was shocking to me. I mean, like, the distances that they were talking about, it sometimes was like less than 20 yards. And I think about the fact that you could throw a football from one side to another and hit somebody. That to me, like, I've never been that close constantly to death. And I thought that one of the most telling lines in the book about how close they were is that there were signs up just before they went into the trenches to put out your cigarettes. And then later in the book, when they talk about the new recruits that weren't smart enough to have listened to or heeded those warnings, they ended up getting killed. So I thought that was absolutely insane. I've never come anywhere close to that. Yeah, and Hannah was saying that she read it as if the characters were on her side, but to somebody else's point, soldiers are universal. It's like as a kid, you play the good guys versus the bad guys. Nobody ever wanted to be on the side of the Nazis or the Axis powers or anything like that. So when I was partway through the book and I realized that I was cheering for him to be able to jump into the other side, I don't know that I was cheering for him to kill anybody, but I was definitely hoping that he would win. And it definitely dropped me into that concept of how we are so tribal. Right? If you read somebody's account of what's going on, their perspective, you understand their life, their family, how they got talked into going to war, all of a sudden you're on their team. So let's keep going. I like what Lyle is saying here about trench warfare almost being a football field level event. And when you think about the fact that these guys were, 6 feet under at some point in time, they were essentially in their own coffins fighting with one another. And it was a really hard thing. One of the first questions that I wrote about in the study guide after the what did you think World War I would be about, and did you know about trench warfare, is at what point did you begin to realize just how dark this book was going to get? And for me, and I know that I had a little bit of a chance to talk with Lyle, and I know he said the same thing, that the book got really, really dark right at the point when they started trying to talk with their friend who they knew was going to die about his boots. And the guy is sitting there saying, I'm not dead, I'm not dying. He can imagine a life of him being able to move beyond being in this medical tent. And everybody around him knows that that's not true. And they're trying to figure out, how can we make sure that his boots become part of our property? When you start thinking about things like that, I mean, that goes on not just, it's at the end of the first chapter and into the second chapter. There's no other book that I can recall that brought life so clearly into focus on that. I see that you guys are looking at the distances as well. I mean, it's worth the time to sit and get some of those aerial maps out to show how those trenches were, because you start realizing, like, all of the phosphorus that went up there. I mean, at many times they were 100 yards apart, but you notice that they didn't know as they were digging trenches and trying to build them closer and closer to the enemy or trying to swoop. They worked in a lot of ways like rivers where they would move up and then back, and it was crazy. The death of Kemmerich was a deep look at something Vance and I talked about today. Jung talks about keeping secrets, Paul wanting to keep the secret of the fact of his death. Wow. That's right. Wow. The death of Kemmerich. So, I was thinking Kantorek when you said that, but you're right. The Kemmerich is the right one. Yeah, both of them knew about it, and neither would talk about it. So what Lyle is making reference to is that I've been going back and I listened to the Carl Jung lectures, and then I went back and listened to them again. And in the very beginning, I heard something that I hadn't heard before. And Jung essentially says, we're taught at a very young age that we should keep secrets. But those secrets are what separate us from other people. They become the barriers that come into our life, and they actually are the form of resistance that keep us from individuating and becoming the full person. And you can see this very clearly in the fact that exactly what Lyle is saying, Kemmerich and Paul both know that he's going to die, and they keep it as a secret from him because who wants to discuss that so openly? I see the Farmer's Life, Dark Ages, dark from the get-go. Half of the group of 150 is dead, but that's no matter. The soldiers are angry at the quartermaster because they can't get double rations that day. It's not that they don't care about their dead comrades. It's just nothing to be done but be practical. I think that's exactly right. And I noticed in the first 2 chapters the way that they're talking about having so much camaraderie and getting along with one another and having a great time. You know that this is the best that it's ever going to get because you don't know enough about them to see how bad it's going to get. And when you start talking about, I actually probably walked right past the quartermaster thing. I was just imagining a bunch of young guys kind of upset with the guy that controls how much food they have. But if you knew from then, you're probably a little bit sharper than I am. R.E. Dark. I found it myself having to take a couple days off pretty early on. I don't know how to explain it, but I needed breaks. That really surprised me. I was talking with this about Lyle too, and man, I feel absolutely terrible that we couldn't make this work. Lyle put a lot of effort into making this happen, and so I'm really sorry about that. But Lyle and I did get a chance to talk about this book quite a bit, and one of the things that happened for me was I realized I couldn't just pick up this book and get through like 2 or 3 pages and then set it down and go work on something else. I was either reading the book or I was not reading the book. And if I was not reading the book, or if I was reading the book, I went to a pretty dark place. So I completely feel you there, Chris. That I really needed to be in the right frame of mind. And I think that that's probably why the audiobook wouldn't have been right for me. Because I found myself being slow at certain lines and certain phrases, and I found that I didn't really want to speed through things. There were times when I just wanted to read a little bit of it and stay there on that same page and then read it again. And I think it's because it was so dark. And then both Lyle and The Farmer's Life, Brian Scott, are talking about the horse image. And, we talk about that later on in some of the questions about, like, what was the thing that came out the most. And that horse screaming thing, that was something that was almost unbearable. I was sitting in the room with my dog, and I remember thinking, what if I heard my dog crying out for hours and hours and hours, and it would be too much to bear. Hannah said, Lyle, that part bothered me too, especially as a horse person. I can't imagine that they got the horses to function in that environment. I'm going to go ahead and give it a shot to try and call Lyle one more time. I would really love to have him on here. If it ends up giving us a feedback loop and him plugging in his headphones doesn't solve it, we'll jump off. But let's give it a shot. This is working out really well. I'm loving how you guys are just jumping in and writing comments. So I'm going to try and patch Lyle in again, but let's just keep it going. The next question that I was interested in approaching was, which characters stick out to you the most? What were the characters that really that really were people that you liked or related to? Did any of the comrades particularly stick out to you? The horses are just victims of something larger than themselves. The men are in the same boat. They're both powerless forces. That's absolutely correct. I think that's the sad reality of what went on there. So I'm giving Lyle a call again, but let's just keep the conversation going.
And writing comments. So I'm going to try and patch Lyle in again, but let's just keep it going. Next question that I was.
Lyle, do you have headphones that you can plug in?
Stick out.
I don't, but I can
What
run over.
What were the characters that really that really were people that you liked or related to? Did any of the comrades particularly stick out to you? The horses are just victims of something larger than themselves. The men are in the same boat. They're both powerless forces. That's absolutely correct. I think that's the sad reality of what went on there.
Oh wow, M Ring. This must be one of the Ring brothers. I actually listened to it in one shot the first time for 20 hours straight overnight. It was crazy. I had to listen again in pieces a couple of weeks later. I mean, I can't even imagine trying to do that in one shot. That would have really messed me up.
I don't, but I can run over.
What were the characters that really that really were people that you liked or related to? Did any of the comrades particularly stick out to you? The horses are just victims of something larger than themselves. The men are in the same boat. They're both powerless forces. That's absolutely correct. I think that's the sad reality of what went on there. Oh wow, M Ring. This must be one of the Ring brothers. I actually listened to it in one shot the first time for 20 hours straight overnight. It was crazy. I had to listen again in pieces a couple of weeks later. I mean, I can't even imagine trying to do that in one shot. That would have really messed me up. What were the characters that really that really were people that you liked or related to? Did any of the comrades particularly stick out to you?
Okay, I see that it's Cat was one that really stuck out to you guys. I started Cat for me. I was just curious how he always found food. Haha. Paul seems intrigued by that too. Then the end, of course. Did you guys have any ideas on how Cat did get that food? I mean, did you have any questions about whether or not it was moral or right? In a lot of cases it says, he just shows up with it. But it was someone else's food. It was somebody else's that he was taking. And it's an interesting thing to think about because we're completely on his side and they're at war. And so we feel a camaraderie to them. But then at the same time, what makes that right or wrong? I certainly wouldn't condemn him. Lyle, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you too.
You have me?
Yep.
Unless I'm getting just the YouTube side of it. I'm hearing YouTube, but I don't know if I'm hearing you on the.
I can hear you perfectly, and it's hard to see how. I can hear you perfectly. You want to talk one more time?
I'm getting the latency is getting me. I've got YouTube on one side and I've got you on the other side.
Is there any way for you to turn off the sound of just the YouTube?
Yeah, I can do that.
And then we'll just have a conversation and expect that they can hear us, because that's what I've had to do. I can't hear anything. It's just flying blind here.
Okay. Okay. We'll try that then.
All right. Well, good. So you and I can talk, and we'll keep saying. So people are talking about their favorite character, and they're saying Cat Cantorick. And one of the questions that I asked while you were away was, how did you feel about how he was getting the food that he was getting? Cat just kept showing up with food, and he was always happy, and people were glad to be there. But the food came from somewhere.
Yeah, Kaczynski. I've always been intrigued by this. They call a guy like that a cumshaw artist, and he's just got this ability to conjure things out of midair, wherever he's at, and you kind of, in these war environments, everything becomes communal property a little bit, and I guess I really wasn't bothered by that. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's just this interesting dynamic of anything goes, everything goes on the war front, because the men are in such a death has become an immediate thing, and it's so stealing things becomes relatively small potatoes relative to the other things that they're doing in the battlefield.
Yeah, I agree. The part that struck me about the theft was when they went in, and I only have a picture of it. I don't remember exactly, but they dropped in to find like the turkeys, and then they kill them somehow, and then they pull them out, and it was only then that I realized somebody is going to come out expecting that they had turkeys there, and those guys had taken them, which I don't blame them. I just think that it Cat was not an all good character, but I don't think he ever claimed to be.
No, he was wanted to be comfortable with himself, and I think with the bond of brotherhood there, he wanted his brothers in arms to be comfortable and as well fed as they could be. So there's a little bit of that dynamic. It was kind of every man for himself, but the band of brothers there was more important than the things going on around them. It was striking as a kind of an analog to this. Let's see here. See if I can find my mark in the book. There's a tab I've got that is marked love here, and it was, as you go through the scene where Cat is cooking the turkeys and they're basting them, they're making the broth, and they're doing all these things that would actually be kind of a normal. It's almost like they were in their home kitchen and they were a Friday night supper sort of a thing. I mean, it just struck me the love that those two men had for each other as they prepared this 4 or 5 course meal in amidst the devastation of this battlefield in this ruined basement that they were in. And all of this is stolen stuff, but it was the love between the two men there was just striking in that.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I had forgotten about the kind of whole feeling of that. And actually, while I was reading that part of it, it made me scared. And it was because in many of the other characters, you have a separation from them. You don't feel, Paul doesn't seem to have that same he has camaraderie, but that was different. And then you're like, what happens if he walks out and this person that he has this deep love with dies? Or actually, I think there were several guys, right? Like, you understand why people end up becoming cold, because even myself, in reading the book, I was trying to be cold, not getting attached to characters, because I didn't want them to die and then have that hurt, which I'm sure would be much more stark if it were real, if it were actually happening to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just fascinating. And then later on in the book, he actually carries Cat back to that aid station across the battlefield, and he's alive, and he gets him to the battlefield dressing station, and he drops him off and thinks he's still alive, and he's been hit in the back of the head with a bullet or a shell fragment or something. And I mean, it's there's love for each other, and then it's just the end of it.
Yeah, and that goes back to what somebody was saying in the comments earlier about how, we see. Oh, I think Brian basically saying that they were upset at the cook but half of their guys were dead, and they weren't sitting there dwelling on it. And that is like the horrifying reality of war, is that you have so much loss that eventually it stops harming you in the way, or at least it stops harming you on the surface. I can't imagine deep down it's not the scars that would last forever.
Yeah, this book is really kind of a staircase of the descent that Paul goes into this deep psychological funk. As you go through the book, it's just a deeper and deeper and deeper funk that he's going into. As he loses more and more of his classmates, and as he loses more and more soldiers that weren't his classmates but are, they're very close to him. They're part of his unit, and just the numbers. He started with, I think, 20 classmates, and then they're down to 13, and then 8, and then 7, and it's just every time you turn around, it's one more that has gone. These are young men. They're 19 years old. They were all in the same high school class, and it just tears the guts out of you.
Well, and what do you think of that? I mean, you were a guy that was in high school at one point in time. Did you encounter a Kantorek that their bold, courageous words that cost them nothing, and then they convince these people to go into essentially the heart of darkness? I mean, this is, many of them would have been conscripted anyway, but the fact that they talk about him having, led them to joyfully join the military, and then even convincing people that didn't want to join. What did you think of that?
That was really disturbing to me. As you picture this guy that's in a leadership position. He's held up by the parents. He's held up by the students in a position of great respect, and so they hang on every word that he's telling them about patriotism and defending your community, defending your country, defending your homeland, defending all the ideals and the everything that goes into this national feeling that you have for your homeland. And then they get to the front, and the reality of the emptiness of what that defense of the homeland is, and the emptiness of the defense of those ideals, and how much, even if they're not killed, how much they lose on the battlefield, mentally and spiritually, and all of the different things that these men leave behind. This is a deep book.
I think the story of Kantorek is the story that, at least for me, as the guy sitting there reading it, the guy that never went to war, that it makes me all the more cautious in the future to ever advocate or say, hey, people, you ought to do this, or hey, young person, this ought to be the way that you think. Because you see, I don't think Kantorek had ill intentions. I just think he was way off of his base. He didn't know what he was talking about. And it's easy to be like, he sent those guys off to war, but there are times when you're like, well, I'm too old, but I can help the cause by talking these other people into it. I think that the biggest warning in the whole book to me was, don't be Kantorek.
I think that applies two ways. There's the teacher side of it, and there's the parent side of it. I've got 2 boys, and as I'm reading through this book, I'm picturing myself being in my early 40s, and my boys that are on either side of being a teenager, and I'm thinking, the things that I teach them, the things that I show them and expect them to value and so on, those are going to be they're going to be life altering depending on what situation they end up in. And my oldest is 13. He's only 5 years away from being in the same position that Paul was in, of either willingly going to war or being conscripted into a battle. And it really does make you think, is this major war worth the lives and minds and hearts of these young men?
So I'm seeing a lot of stuff. Brian Scott is talking about the line from the very beginning of give them all the same grub and all the same pay, and the war would be over and done in a day. Is the party marked? Yeah, that's when they're talking about who actually fights the war. I mean, he didn't spare any punches right in the very beginning. He was saying the wrong people are fighting this war. It should be somebody else, and that's something you hear a lot of. I'm sure you can imagine soldiers all over the place saying. But it isn't until you get way deeper into this book that you're like, you know what, you're 100% right. This is if the people that decided to go to war had to experience these things, or they had to put their sons in there, I think they'd probably treat it pretty differently.
Yeah.
So, one of the other things I wanted to ask about before we move on from the character section was, were there any actions, and this could be leaving to go visit the women illegally? You know, they left the camp, they went AWOL. You know, guys are going to go get that sort of thing done with. But did you hold it against them? And did you hold against them the way they treated Himmelstoss, the way that they put him in a sack and beat him unfairly? What did you guys think about that?
The women thing was kind of an interesting one because as I read the book the first time, I thought, this is just men and women being men and women, and they're finding a relationship in the midst of this war. And as I read it again, and then I guess the third time actually, I realized these women are starving because of this war. They have nothing, and these men have these extra rations. And so this was really more of a transactional relationship than it was a romantic relationship or anything like that. If this war hadn't happened, would those people have come together in that way? Probably not, because it's such a transactional relationship. As I read it through the third time and realized what was really going on in that, the women were doing what they were doing just to get something to eat.
Well, and then there was that other part, and I can't remember. It's like didn't they go back to visit, and the women were not as impressed with them because there wasn't that kind of tension there, or I can't remember that exact part. But it definitely struck me because at first you're like, oh, young love and through war, and this is kind of a relaxing thing. But then you also have the transactional aspect of it, which feels uncomfortable. You know what happens, but it felt weird. But then you couple that with the fact that the women somewhat rejected them the time they went back, and that was surprising to me. I didn't expect that.
It almost kind of made me wonder if these women just had an ongoing relationship with every soldier that came in, whether they were French or German or British, or I mean they were kind of they were on those front lines too, and they were getting tossed back and forth by the whims of the battlefield, the whims of the front line, and so they were doing what they had to do to survive, and much like the men were, but the men were getting a different thing from that relationship than the women were. But yeah, it's a tough thing.
Yeah, and Hannah is saying here, I did not like that part. I mean, if you think about it from the aspect of the women, well, anybody, like, it's just, yeah, I definitely felt uncomfortable about that part. I don't think anybody, at first it felt pretty nice, but then when you realize what's actually going on there, you realize this is people just trying to survive, maybe biology just pushing itself forward. So Chris Houseworth says, Himmelstoss did not get beaten unfairly, in my opinion. He was a jerk because he could be. They had a chance for payback, and I had no issue with them taking their shot. What'd you think of that?
I kind of agree. Himmelstoss, early in the book, as their drill instructor, was doing what he had to do at some level to create emotional hardness in the men and make them be resilient to do the things that they'd have to do in the battle. But he took it too far, and in a sense, he was like Cantora, where he was pushing the men into something that he wasn't really going to have to do. He had a safe spot in the rear. He was training the men, and as long as he could maintain that safe spot, he was insulated from it. So he could brutalize these men as much as he wanted. He was a bully, and so when they got a chance to get even with him before they went to the front and beat him in that pillowcase, you kind of relate to these guys. Yeah, this guy's staying behind where it's safe, and these guys are going into the front. I can't really blame them for cleaning that guy up.
So
but then later,
19-year-old Lyle, who would you have been in that group? Would you have been the guy that planned it? Would you have been a guy that participated? Would you have been a guy that avoided, or would you have been the guy that took out every last bit of his frustration out on Himmelstoss?
Oh, I would have absolutely been involved in the planning, and I probably would have been the guy that dropped the pillowcase over him. As I look back to my college years, I was always in the thick of things. So honestly, I I can see myself being in that situation, and I can see myself pushing back against the established authority that was represented there by Himmelstoss, and so I can certainly relate to these young troopers as they vented their frustrations on him. But it's striking to me then later, as we read in the book and develop Himmelstoss's character, when he ends up at the front, all of a sudden that relationship has completely shifted, and Himmelstoss is the guy that is now the rookie. He's kind of the boot, and ultimately he ends up in the bunker and he's a coward. And so that transition from being a bully when he had the opportunity to being an abject coward when he was faced with the reality of the battle, that it was an interesting character development there to see that Himmelstoss took advantage of situations where he could, and then all of a sudden the situation took advantage of Himmelstoss.
Yeah, that might have been one of the most humanizing moments of any book I'd ever read. You know, when you find Himmelstoss in the bunker, afraid, and he doesn't want to go out, and Paul grabs him by the neck and basically forces him out. I think earlier in the book, I probably would have been like, yeah, get him out there. But then you realize, like, it would be terrifying. It would be absolutely terrifying. And I would be just as bad as Himmelstoss if I thought of him as a coward in that moment. And yet, here I sit, warm next to my fire as I'm reading my book. I thought he was really well humanized in that part. And if maybe other people still felt like resentful or bitter towards him, but I didn't. I felt nothing but a deep sense of pity for him.
Yeah, I think that's about all you can feel for him. On my law enforcement side, in the years that I've spent doing that, and not only being trained, but then also training law enforcement officers underneath me, and then being in some of these situations, you run into these things where you're training. I won't say you fail your training doesn't fail you. You fail your training, and you become overwhelmed in these things. So there was a piece of that where I could kind of relate to this guy, where he was absolutely overwhelmed and he failed his training, and so he's cowering in this bunker, and that's it doesn't happen every time, and maybe a different day he would have had a different reaction. But yeah, absolutely, that was as humanizing as it gets. You see both sides of Himmelstoss amazingly.
What tell me a little bit more about your law enforcement and where you saw, because that's the second time you've mentioned to me that really brought some parallels home for you. Tell me more about that.
Sure. So I'm a reserve deputy for the county sheriff's office. I did that as in about 2000. I went through the training and was sworn as a reserve deputy. And for me, it was a way to give back to the community. I felt I felt a need to do that, and I felt it was something that I could do that maybe other people couldn't, and so that was how I got there. Once I got into that job, then I began to realize that there's two very different sides of your community. There's the 8 to 5 crowd that is kind of us, the white collar, blue collar. And then there's the after 10 o'clock crowd that runs till about 3. It's a whole different community. And when I joined law enforcement, I felt like I could make a difference, and I could make positive change and protect people. And at some point, I realized it was very hard to protect that after 10 o'clock community. And the 8 to 5 community really didn't need protected too much. So there was an interesting dynamic as I watched Paul in this thing realize that if they hadn't started the war, they may not have needed to protect Germany or any of the other countries that were involved. There wasn't a need there, and so that's kind of a parallel that I got between this and my law enforcement career, is that the 8 to 5 crowd kind of handles their own stuff, and they're good, honest people, and they do things the right way. As we talked about earlier, the wrong people were fighting the war, and that's kind of the connection I've had with the law enforcement. The after 10 crowd need to police up their own stuff a little bit.
Yeah, because they're doing it to themselves in a way. That's very interesting. we kind of already talked about this, and I actually was trying to recall which of the deaths was most difficult for you, and the one that you described has to have been for me the moment, and that was when he was carrying when Paul was carrying, what was his name?
That was Kaczynski, Katz, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that was just brutal. But were there other deaths that stuck out to you? I actually felt like when I wrote that question, I wrote it because I couldn't remember the deaths. I think it's because they all blended together to me.
They had death was a constant. I think the two that probably, well, there was a wounding and there was a death, and one was there was a soldier that was grievously wounded, and they had that moral discussion there on the battlefield about whether or not they should shoot the guy, because they knew that he was going to be in pain for about 3 days and then was ultimately going to die, and they were having that conversation of how they should do it and what they should do, and then other soldiers showed up and they realized that they had witnesses, and they sent the guy to a first aid station. So I mean, there was that dynamic that was really man, it just reaches out and grabs you. And then I think the one that affected me most was when Paul was coming back across the battlefield amidst that shelling, and he ended up in that shell hole with that French soldier that was alive when he jumped in the hole, and he realized the guy's there, and he ends up sliding the bayonet in him. And then the shelling continues, and so he spends a day and a half in that shell hole with that French soldier that he's just stabbed. And he starts to realize, I mean, he makes that human connection with that soldier that he's just killed, or has created his death. That was just gut wrenching to read that and see that man die before him. And then he's going through his wallet afterwards, and he realizes this guy was a printer, and he's got a wife and a child. And I think at the end of the chapter there, it says his name was Gerard Duval, and he was. It says I've killed Gerard Duval, the printer. I think wildly that I shall have to become a printer. And so he's already trying to reconcile what he's done to this man and to this career and to that. I mean, that one was stark to me.
Yeah, that scene had a big impact on me for a couple of reasons. The first one is that I actually started reading that, and then I had to stop and put it down, and I didn't come back for about 36 hours. And I remember picking up the book and being like, oh my gosh, all that time when I went to bed and I made breakfast, and then I went for a jog with my dog, and then I went and worked for a few hours, and all these things that I did, and he was in a damn hole next to a guy he had, in his feeling, murdered, right? Killed, or,
Yep.
But that was really profound, because you really think about what is 36 hours or whatever it was, a day and a half that he was in there. But the other thing was, when he pulled out that stuff and he found out he was a printer, Pete Scotese, one of the guys that I interviewed, my mentor, has told me about the first time he ever encountered a man that he killed when he was in war. And essentially it was the same thing. He pulled out, he opened up his wallet, he found a photo of that this guy was clearly his wife had given him. And he was like, I don't deserve this. I don't want this. I don't want to see this. And if it can happen in a book and it can happen to Pete, it must have happened millions and millions and millions of times, and it's so sad. So I'm reading some of the comments here. The Hannah saying, one page I earmarked was when Paul described the transformation of how he perceived the enemy he stabbed. He stabbed in abstraction, but really he's a man like him. That's right. And then Jeff Pomrenka, my good buddy Jeff. Jeff is the guy that actually got me started on podcasting. So anybody wants to know who that guy is, he is the man. Himmelstoss's biggest weakness was that he did not learn from his training. That's where he fell down. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. The hospital that Paul went to, this is Brian Scott, was in several ways worse than being in the front. The hospital was a potentially very slow and painful death. You know it's coming and how it will be. Yeah, so let's talk about changing scenes away from the war, because that's when the war becomes really in focus. It's when they get out and they did this stuff, like he went home for a while. What did you think of that home visit? And did you have anything that you could in your life relate to where you left and then came back and the expectations were different than what the reality was?
That home visit was a critical piece of the book. I thought he's been at the front. He's seen all this horror. He comes home and he's expecting things to be exactly the way he left them, and here his she's sick, and the dad's. I mean, obviously there's great poverty. The war has affected the home front too. There's not enough food for the family. They're just scraping to make by, and so he comes back, and it's almost a burden on. It's another mental burden to add to him that he's got to worry about his family now that he knows that they are. They're just struggling to make it ends meet, and he's actually living better at the front from a food perspective than his family is at home. So that was stark. There's always such a separation between the battlefield and the homecoming. In my law enforcement experience, you go out and you work a shift and you get into some bad thing, whatever it is, and then you go home, and in my law enforcement experience, you're home in a half hour, and you maybe still have the smell, you maybe still have the fluids from whatever you were in on your uniform. You strip out of that, and you're home, and there's this huge. You still feel dirty from that incident. That's where Paul was at in this deal. He's got all this emotional baggage he's taken home with him, and all of a sudden he's back in clean sheets, and there's curtains on the windows, and there's the sidewalks are swept. There's not mud. There's not. I mean, it's just such a stark separation there. That really hit me. That experience is going to be that much bigger than what I've seen on the law enforcement side. But it's always there's such a separation there when you come home and you hug your wife, you see your kids, you think, man, I'm sure glad that they didn't see what I saw.
Yeah, when I came back from the Peace Corps, I had to leave. I got medically separated, which meant I was in the Peace Corps one day, and then it was like, nope, you're done, and it was out fast, right? And my father had been in the Peace Corps, and he told me before I left, when you come back, whenever you come back, it is going to be a struggle. And I didn't really understand what he meant. But it was that you have just come back, and Peace Corps and this thing would have been completely different. But I was in Africa. Everything about my world was different. My mind was processing it all the time. You come back, and for the first 15 minutes, people want to talk about where you were and what it was like. But then they want to go on to, we're back in the regular world, and you have this dialogue going on in your head of the people you left behind and the what was going on there and how different it was, and it's so disjointed. And to imagine doing that while the thing that's going on in the back of your mind is some of the most brutal warfare that's ever occurred, that must have been terrible. And the part where it really rang home for me was when his dad just didn't get it. He wanted to talk about the war in a much more positive way, and he just didn't understand.
And the analog to that then is that drunk that he goes. His dad gives him a few marks and sends him to the bar to have a drink, and as if he's just one of the good old boys again home. And so he gets there, and there's that drunk on the bar stool that's telling him, "Boy, you soldiers just need to do this and this, and the war's going to be won." And this, he lays out all the strategy for him, and he, in a sense, he's just like Himmelstoss. He's just like Kantorek. He's got no skin in the game, but he's busy giving advice, and then he's patting himself on the back for giving Paul a couple cigars and some cigarettes and buying him a drink. And there's just that huge disconnect there between what Paul has experienced and what the home people think he's experiencing and are projecting on him and what they expect him to think about it. And so it was just that. I see the farmer's life here as posted. The war has ruined us for everything, and that sums it up. I mean, it really did. It ruined an entire generation.
Yeah, and when I was just getting out of college, I had friends that joined the military shortly after September 11th had happened, because I was in college when that happened. And so people from back home joined the military. And then when I would go back home and see them when they were on leave from the war or from the military, I would love to go around to the bars and tell everybody, hey, this is my buddy, he's a vet, he's a vet, he's a vet. And I had one of my friends, they liked it at first because they were getting free drinks. But then I had a buddy be like, hey, I don't want to talk about this stuff. This is not fun for me. This is not, the cheap drinks come at the cost that people now want to talk to me about being at war, and that's not possible. And I remember being really embarrassed. And so that part of the drunk, again, and I'm embarrassed, but I feel like a lot of the loser characters in here, I see myself in those things, and it's like, oh God, I don't want to be that. So maybe maybe this book, one of the greatest services that it does for people like me, is to say, you're never going to understand, but what you should understand is keep your mouth shut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have started to understand why vets, that World War II, what we call the greatest generation, they came back and they didn't talk about it largely. They saw the World War II, which was a every bit as intense of warfare, but not maybe less. It didn't have the trench warfare aspect so much, but they didn't talk about it. Those men kept quiet until many of them until their final years, and then finally they started to open up a little bit. But you can kind of understand why they didn't have anything to talk about when they came home. There was just, they wanted to leave that part of them, those several years behind them in Europe.
Yeah, and I think that we get the sense that soldiers like the fight or like the battle. And when I was interviewing Pete and I asked him, what do you think of war? And he says, I'm violently against it. He is a 99-year-old guy that is even keel all the time. You ask him that, and he is instantly like, nothing good comes from this. I am violently opposed. And he'll even say now, he still, as a World War II vet, said, I wish we would have done more diplomatically. I wish we would have tried harder. And I think that those are things that are hard for people like me to get. But again, you say you read this book, and all of a sudden you start saying, like, I can see why Pete would say that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's horrific things that you cannot wash off yourself. I've had calls myself, and again, my law enforcement career is far less than the visceral experience of this. But there's things you come home and you don't feel like you can take a shower and get clean enough from, and that's, I think, kind of what was going on here with Paul was he couldn't get clean enough from that. And they're part of the book there. He talks about how his generation had nothing to live for, and the older soldiers, the guys that were in their maybe late 20s or 30s, that had wives at home, they had kids at home, they had businesses to go back to. Those guys had something to go back to, and yet this generation that he says the war has ruined us for everything. They've got nothing to go home to, and they've got all this emotional and psychological baggage. That's all they've gotten out of this war. It's just a gruesome thing.
Well, and they talked about, and I don't know how strong this research is, but there's a theory that talks about in Vietnam, there were all these guys that became addicted to heroin, and they were really worried, the military, like, what are we going to do when we send these guys back and they don't have access to heroin? Like, this is going to be a big problem. But it turns out when people went home, if they had a family and if they had a job, they had almost no relapses with heroin. They're very, very few and far between. And you think about, like, but those that went back and they didn't have that, they were homeless, or they didn't have a family, or they didn't have a job, those are the ones that'll fall into that pit. And whether you put it as heroin or alcohol or whatever, that's what it would likely be filled with.
Yeah, without a support network for our vets, it's very hard to come home.
It seems to me that this the vet thing became much more clear to me. That's been one of those issues that's always been like a problem for other people in the world, but I definitely felt a sense of obligation that I did not feel before.
Mm-hmm. And there's really two different. This book talks about the death and the wounds, and the book itself, I think, is really about the psychological aspects of it. It doesn't really talk about it directly, but that's what the book is about, is that psychological cost to the war. And we always think in terms of the paralyzed veterans of America, or the guys that come home missing a limb or two, but really there's a lot more soldiers that come home that have in a sense even worse wounds than missing a limb, because they've left a part of their mind over there, or left a part of their soul over there. That's what this book's about, is those pieces that they've left behind. They're internal wounds. You can't see them, but they're as deep as any amputation is.
One of my jiu-jitsu coaches is a returned vet, and he talks about all the time. I'm so grateful that he does it, because every time when you have class, you don't know who else is in there. I mean, you know a little bit about the guys, but you don't know what they're going through. And so he's like, I'm a former vet. I suffer from PTSD. And then he goes in to talk about what it's all about. One time he was talking, he's like, it's like being alert all of the time, like ready to kill all the time. And I can't imagine trying to have a functional relationship if I would. He was like, I'm ready to fight to the death at any moment. And I was like, how could you have, it'd be so difficult to carry on a conversation, to be in a room with strangers, to be with somebody you love. If you're always at go time, it's awful.
Yeah, that hyper alertness. I've employed a couple of veterans on the farm here, and it's always interesting to get their experiences. As you develop a friendship with these men, they've seen some horrific things, and they bring that home, and they mostly do a pretty good job of hiding that. But it's pretty ugly.
So I think we're going to round out the time. Maybe we'll take another 10 minutes. But if with this 10 minutes, what are some things that stuck out to you about this book that maybe we haven't hit on? I have some other questions in here about, like, should they have been punished if they got caught? And we could talk about the ending. Did you expect that he was going to die? But I'm also interested in if there's other parts about this book that stuck out to you that maybe that didn't fit easily onto a study guide.
I guess there's a couple of things this thing of keeping secrets. We talked about Carl Jung and that, so he visits with the mother of one of his soldiers who was killed, and he wants to tell her. He doesn't want to tell her the details. And she wants to know how he died, and he doesn't want to go there with her. And finally, he tells her, he was shot cleanly through the heart, and he felt no pain. And he wanted to protect her from what the realities of the battlefield were. That jumped out at me. And again, he was carrying that load, so that mother didn't have to carry that load. And I see Hannah mentions here his interaction with the Russian prisoners. That was where I was going to go next. It was really interesting watching him see the broken spirits of those Russian POWs. They were empty, broken men, and they were watching their numbers die from starvation and other things. And he started to realize they were men just as he was. And the Farmer's Life mentions that one of the prisoners had a violin, and that really jumped out at me, that these guys were, they'd come to the front lines of World War I, and here this guy has brought not only a rifle with him, but he's got a violin, and that's a way for him to reach back to his roots, or his home country, or his family. That was a connection they had back to the motherland. And that really jumped out at me.
Yeah, that's like just such a hugely humanizing force there, right? Like, all of a sudden, you now have to come to terms with the fact that these people had a life before they went to war too. They weren't this evil thing. They were people that spent the years and years and years it would take to learn to play the violin. Yeah. So one of the Ring brothers, after they counterattacked the French line, and most of what they brought back was food that meant life just as much as ammo did. I think that scene of running over there, it wasn't. I noticed that it was not a hugely descriptive scene. He didn't spend a lot of time going into all the verbiage and try and paint that picture. It was pretty stark, and yet the tension of them being over in the other one, and then when you realize that he's lost, that was one of the scariest scenes in any book I've maybe ever read. I got to tell you, Lyle, I think this was an amazing choice of a book because there are so many times when I say, I never read anything like this before.
This book is probably one of the top 10 I've read, and I'm a reader. I read a lot, but it was such a simple, direct, honest look at what a soldier's life was in World War One. This was an amazing book.
So Chris Houseworth was asking, how did he die? And it's basically he stood up and then he was shot right in the back of the head.
He was. Let's see. He was. It says he fell in October 1918 on a day that was so still and quiet along the front line that the Army dispatches restricted themselves to the single sentence that there was nothing new to report on the Western Front. He had sunk forward and was lying on the ground as if asleep. When they turned him over, you could see that he could not have suffered long. His face wore an expression that was so composed that it looked like as if he were almost happy that it had turned out that way. It doesn't say how he died. When I read it, I assumed he'd been hit with a shell fragment or something, and I don't know that it matters how it was that he met his end, but to me, in that ending, it was almost a sense of relief to me after having read the book and seen how much baggage he was going to take away from the war if he survived it. This was almost a clean ending because it was just an ending for him.
Well, I agree.
I don't know how to describe it or how to put it into words, but it was almost a relief that was the way the book ended.
Well, I mean, Brian, the farmer's life brings up, that how much the rats frightened him, or at least like it was so disgusting, and they talked about the moldy food. I mean, how much better. It is significantly more cathartic to think of him as just dying as opposed to dying and being eaten by the rats. Which, like, if you think of a horrible, horrible punishment, that would be it. Okay, so as we close out, what are the thoughts on war that you take away from this? Clearly it's horrifying, it's terrible. Anything else?
I don't know what else you can say. It's as you look at the roots of World War I and why it started, there wasn't any good reason. And as you look at the end of World War I, nothing was solved. And 20 years later, World War I started over again for all the same reasons that the war had started in the first place. And really, it was just a lack of countries, in essence, people, being able to sort out their differences. If you boil it all the way down, that's what it is. And yet, it's the people of the country that end up paying the price for the leaders of the country being unable to reach that agreement over whatever the border should be or whatever the trade. Whatever it was, there were a lot of causes, but I don't know. I just wish people could get along.
So I went to diplomacy school for graduate school, and one of the ways that they describe World War I is that there were many of the battles or many of the the conflicts occurred because there were secret treaties, and that there were agreements between countries saying, well, if you get attacked, then we'll come in, and nobody really knew exactly how it would trigger all of the various parties to come into conflict with one another. And that's why, as a function after World War I, the only way an international treaty is international truly is if you have a public instrument. You make the treaty public. And I think that goes to this weird thing that you and I have been talking about with secrets and the concept of catharsis, right? When you get rid of a secret, when you're able to express it, it allows you to breathe free and to get along. And I know this book was not about secrets, but it does seem like there's no catharsis in war. The only catharsis we ever had was that Paul had a death that wasn't horrifying to us. And that's probably a good way to think about war. There's nothing good that's going to come from it other than death. So here are some lines. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Lev.
I had a really interesting experience a couple years ago. I went over to Germany as a guest of the German-American Chamber of Commerce, and the history of that was that the German-American Chamber of Commerce was an offshoot of the Marshall Plan after World War II, and so since the war stopped, they have sent about 4 exchange trips a year, every year since then, back and forth between Germany and the U.S. And the idea is that people that communicate with each other and people that understand each other's culture cannot go to war with each other. And so that's the purpose of this, is to create all these different interlocking relationships across all industries. I went over as a farmer. We did an ag exchange, but the trip before ours had been electric motor manufacturers. The trip before that had been refrigerator manufacturers. So there's all these different connections. But the idea is that if you send people over with a camera and cash in their pocket, it's far better than if you send them over with a rifle in their hands and grenades in their pockets. And so the more we can do of those kinds of outreaches around the world prevents the sort of cataclysmic conflict that was World War I and that was World War II and now our current global war on terror, which really is more of the same thing. It's just a lack of understanding and a lack of ability to relate to another culture that's very different.
Yeah, I mean, I see that in the Peace Corps, and I mean, for how much money is spent there and how it all works, you could have a lot of complaints about the Peace Corps. But I can say, for one, when all the stuff was going on in Kenya and those riots were happening, I definitely had a much more sense that these are people that have families, they're intelligent, they aspire for a better life. This is not what they want. Whereas if I had been watching that, having never been to Kenya, I would have just been like, oh, look at them, they're fighting again. And that's something that's really important. Dan mentioned something, and this is a great thing. And, he said, I mentioned it on Twitter, but I thought this book made me much more aware of Soleimani when he was killed and how pro-America or pro-war I was in my social interactions. And I was grateful that I was reading it. 100%. 100%. We sit in the country with all the power, and it's really easy to be like, oh, just turn them into glass, just go blow them up. And this book makes you go like, wait a second, really slow down here.
It doesn't. This book with its German perspective was interesting to me because I'd never really thought about, I'll say the other side, and yet it didn't matter which side of the trenches you were on, whether you were an Italian, a German, a Brit, a Russian, an American, a Scots, an Aussie, or a Turk if you were on the Gallipoli front. They all fought the same war, and they all were victimized by the same things. It was the wrong men fighting this war, and none of these men individually had a quarrel with the guy on the other side of the trench. It was just the uniform that they were shooting at that happened to be filled with somebody else, and the humanization of that was just super striking. I was looking at the Christmas truce here a while back and the history of that, and those men stopped fighting because they realized they shared Christmas in common. And the carols were the same. They were, the German words were different than the English words, but the tune was the same. And they reached that accommodation of, we don't have a problem, our countries have the problem, our leadership has the problem. And so it was really interesting to watch that Christmas special on the Christmas truce against the backdrop of having read this book and seen Paul interact with that poor Frenchman, the Gerard in the shell hole and stuff. There was our human connections are so deep around the world.
Yeah, and that's exactly what Dan Bingham were talking about, and Brian about. The thing that people wanted was to be back home, and so maybe the big takeaway is if you can't do anything to stop war, at least be grateful for the home that you have. So
Yep.
I'm going to wrap this up, and I'm going to make a plug for next month's book, which is my literal favorite book. It's the best book I've ever read. It is called The True Believer, and it's by Eric Hoffer. And the book is it's thoughts on the nature of mass movements. And so what Eric Hoffer does is he goes through and he discusses why is it that people hand over their independent thought and become a part of a larger movement. And the book is a very philosophical book. However, Hoffer was a longshoreman, so he used to carry cargo on and off ships, and he was a regular blue-collar guy, and he wrote it in a way that I've heard him say in interviews, I wanted my buddies that I worked with to be able to read this book as well. And so it's a very easy book to get into. It's about the same time period. It's a little later than All Quiet on the Western Front because it's taking a look at what happened in Germany and Soviet Union. But it is an excellent book. It's nonfiction, so it's going to be serious, and I don't know exactly how we'll have a conversation, but I'd love to keep doing this. And Lyle, you're always welcome back in the co-host seat if you'd like it.
I'd love to come back. This was just a true pleasure to work with you on this, Vance, and this was fun reading the book in this format and then discussing it afterwards. I really enjoyed this. I look forward to your new book too.
Let's all try and, I think these things, the comments were great. Hannah, I was so grateful the whole time you were reading and talking about it. I loved on Twitter when people were saying what part of the book they were in. I felt like that made the beginning of the month really solid. So the plan is for the book club to be the last Sunday of the month. So we'll do it at either 7:30 or 8. Probably 7:30 on the last Sunday of the month. Unless that throws everybody wildly out of whack and it doesn't work. But
that works good here.
So until then, guys, share it on Twitter. Talk about it in other places. Let's try and get other people to join. But I am so glad you guys came, and we'll see you around. So have a great night.
Thanks for joining us on As the Crow Flies.